All right, we're ready to get going. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on creating a data validation and testing strategy. My name is Bill Hayduck. I'm your host for the webinar. Mike Calabrese, one of RTTS top engineers with over 11 years of experience in the application and data testing space, will be presenting the information on how to create, excuse me, a data validation and testing strategy. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window. We'll answer as many questions as we can after Mike's presentation. Also, please use the chat to alert us if you have any issues or seeing or hearing the session. Thanks again for your time and participation. Now I'll hand it over to Mike to kick it off. Mike?
All right, thank you, Bill, and welcome everyone. My name is Mike Calabrese. I am a team lead and senior test engineer for RTTS. RTTS has been in business since 1996, so we're celebrating our 24th anniversary this year. We are located out of New York City, but have customers and clients all over the world. We also have strategic partnerships with some of the top names in the technology and data space. And we are the premier pure play QA and testing firm with specialization in test automation. So for our webinar today, we're going to have 5 different topics. We're going to start with an introduction into the big data landscape. Then we're going to talk a little bit about data validation, some of the challenges around data validation and the solutions for them. Then we'll touch upon the key components of a data validation assessment. And then we'll look to take a deeper dive into data testing strategies. And finally, we'll wrap up with a case study of a company who has gone through the data validation assessment and focus on some of the key benefits they have realized from going through a data validation assessment. So to start off with our introduction, talking about some of the big impacts of big data. We truly are living in a data-centric world now. Walmart, one of the biggest retail organizations in the world, handles more than 1 million customer transactions every hour. So that's about 2.5 petabytes of data coming into their systems. And to sort of put that in perspective, that's about 167 times the information contained in all the books of the U.S. Library of Congress. Some of the other big tech names out there also handling large and tremendous amounts of data: Facebook, Twitter, Google. And not only the big or large tech giants out there, both companies, small and large, are sort of realizing the benefits of big data. And they're spending money. So the data warehouse marketplace is forecast to generate nearly $17 billion in revenue by 2020. The business intelligence marketplace, so how the tools and the software that you're using to analyze all of this data, is forecast to grow by 22.8 billion. And just taken as a whole, the big data marketplace, with the hardware, the software, and the professional services wrapped around it, on track to spend more than $72 billion. And so companies are out there, they're spending money, and they're spending money for good reason. With whatever business or vertical you're in, you are taking in all of this data, it's moving through your system. And ultimately, companies are taking a look and trying to analyze all this data for whichever space they're in. And they're using these business intelligence and analytics reports to make key decisions on their company and the direction of their company. And it's very important that the underlying data that these reports are based off of is accurate and really represents a true picture of the current landscape of your company. If that data is bad, if there is some misinformation in those reports, poor data quality can cost organizations on the order of 14.2 million annually. Companies that are willing to spend the time, the effort, and the resources to clean up that data will realize both a cost and revenue savings. And on the other hand, if a company were not to spend that time, spend those resources, you could end up causing your business revenue between 15 and 25%. So now I'd like to talk about data validation and what is data validation. And it is just the process of verifying your data is completely and accurately moved through your systems according to the business requirements. So at its most basic level, you're taking in some source data. If you're a financial company, maybe it's some financial transactions. Maybe it's some customer orders that are coming in if you're customer facing business, and all that data is going to go through what we call an ETL process. So extracting from the source data, then applying some transformations based on the business logic, and ultimately loading it into a target system. So sort of a simplified look at really the basics of what's happening as your data is moving through the system. Now, to test that data, there are a couple different data validation types that we can focus on, and the first one being data completeness. So this is verifying that all your data has been loaded from the source to the target data warehouse. It moves through your system effectively, and ultimately displaying properly in those BI reports that we talked about earlier. In addition to that, in addition to data moving and being completely moved through your system, there should be a focus on the data transformation. So is that data being updated and transformed properly as it moves from your source to your target systems? Data quality is also a big piece of this. So as data is coming in from all of these source systems, is the ETL process correctly rejecting or substituting any incorrect values? Is the process able to handle and report on those bad sources of data, or does it just break entirely? Those are important things to understand. And also the BI reports themselves. There is a developmental element to these BI reports. They are pulling from an underlying data source, so it's important to make sure that is updated and accurate. But the reports themselves also do handle and apply some calculated fields or values. So you're really wanting to make sure that your BI reports are representing a true vision and an accurate data representation of your underlying data. And finally, the BI performance of your report. So are they generating in a reasonable amount of time? Are your end users happy with the data they're seeing and the time that they're seeing this data? So now I'd like to talk about just some of the different categorizations of bad data that we may see in our data validation process. The first being missing data. So data that has not made it from your source to your target. So maybe due to an incorrect lookup table or an invalid join in the ETL process. In addition to that, truncation of data is also a key issue to keep an eye on. So this is data maybe that's moving across your system, but let's say it's a large text field, and in your target database, the field width cannot handle that. So you end up seeing certain data points being cut off. Data type mismatch is another important and key issue that we do find. So if, for example, you are having a varchar value and that's not coming across or getting translated into a date field value, those could cause issues sort of down the line. So each of these data elements within your database has a data type, and it's important to make sure they're set up correctly, especially for processing later on in the cycle. The next two issues talk about translations, and this has to do with null values. So null fields in your database are simply an empty field in your database. And that is different than, let's say, an empty string versus the null value. Those would be two different sort of translations that can happen. So you're wanting to make sure that your ETL process is understanding and accepting of what it's expecting as far as null values, whether it be the empty string or a null value. You want to make sure that's handled properly. And the final three for misplaced data, extra records, not enough records. You want to making sure that your data is getting to the right place and the right destination. You want to make sure it's not being misplaced or filtering onto any other additional tables. And as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, we really are dealing with so much data these days. A lot of these data warehouses are designed to compress and compact all of that information into a readable field. So a lot of filters are being applied. So you want to making sure that you're filtering out the proper records and you're not excluding anything that's important. And on the other side, you're not bringing in too much information to cause any problems. Continuing on here, just some transformation logic, errors and holes. So you may see this in, for example, a developer develops a unit test, tests a couple of the key specific use case values, but doesn't consider any sort of edge cases. That can certainly pop up in a production environment for something that's unexpected. So it's important to fully understand the transformation logic and be able to identify those holes. Even small or simple errors can cause large problems down the line. So something as simple as a comma or a decimal place or an extra white space, if you're looking at a BRI report, may not read that properly because it's unexpected value. The next one is a sequence generator, which we see a lot in incremental or historical data testing, where you're wanting to make sure that your data is properly in line. You don't want to be reporting revenue or any key indicators out of date or out of sequence. And undocumented requirements is another issue that we come across. So it's important here, and we're going to stress it throughout the presentation, that these ETL processes are documented fully. This is important for both testing and regression testing. We want to make sure that everything is fully understood from every member on the team. Duplicate records is another common issue that is seen, and this can happen with sort of the complicated ETL joins that may be going on, where you're joining several different tables or joining to itself. You're wanting to make sure that you're not duplicating any of the records within your systems. Numerical field precision is another big one. You're wanting to make sure, especially if you're dealing with any financial transactions, that rounding is going to be a key issue here. You don't want to be over or under reporting any of those key financial indicators, and you want to make sure your numerical field precision is set to the expected value in this case. And as we talked about earlier with the data quality, rejected rows, making sure that data that's coming into the system that is maybe invalid or has some issues properly getting rejected. It's not breaking the entire ETL process. It's being reported, and then the jobs themselves are moving on. So with all these bad data issues, a lot of companies out there are asking themselves some questions. They're facing some challenges. They're asking how much of this data needs to be validated. How do I ensure that I am using the proper data permutation? So am I exercising that ETL logic properly? What are the critical endpoints that need to be tested? How do I verify the data from the various source systems that it's all coming into my architecture and moving successfully through? A lot of companies now are moving from on-prem resources to the cloud. So how do we handle that? Is the bad data that we just discussed, is that making it into the architecture? And if so, how do we identify it? And given the fact that we're dealing with so much data these days, how much of this testing can be automated? So we'll start with finding bad data, and the point at which you find this bad data is key here. So if it's an end user, if it's a customer or an executive that's viewing a business intelligence report, you'll see that the cost increases tremendously from identifying these earlier on in the cycle to later on. It's going to cost you both in reputation and in resources and dollars. So the earlier on you identify these issues, the better. The majority are going to be found in the QA test cycle, which is the focus of that cycle, to identify and flesh out any of these issues. And in order to do that, you're going to first want to identify all of your testing points within the system. So anywhere data is being moved from one source to another, you would want to consider that a testing point. And each of those testing points should have a data mapping associated with it. So a document that will define how the data is expected to move through the system. And once you have that information, you'll be able to develop some data testing strategies around that. And we'll go a bit deeper into those in the data testing strategies section. But you can, at a high level, do some comparisons between your source and target. If you're expecting some incremental testing to happen, you can do row counts to see that fields or rows have been added. If you're looking to compare data between the two and find any differences, you can implement minus queries. And there are several automation tools out there to help you with your data validation efforts. Another question that has come up is for data testing permutation. So how do I really test all the logic that's going on here? And again, that starts with the data mappings that I discussed earlier. The definition of how the data is supposed to move through the system will allow you to develop a test data set. So reviewing that transformation logic, understanding the case statements or the field merges or the field splits that are going on will allow you to develop that test data set. So you make sure that if there is a case statement, for example, that you are exercising all the paths within that case statement. And similarly, if you're dealing with translations or lookups, you're exercising all of the lookups within that table. And that sort of brings us to our next topic of test standard data generation. And what we most commonly see is that companies are reproducing production data within their systems. And that sort of gives a sort of real world picture of the data that the systems are going to experience as they move through the ETL process. However, certain production scenarios may not hit all of your data testing permutations. So in that case, we do see some homegrown scripts or some freeware that's available out there on the internet to generate this data to make sure you're hitting all of your data test permutations. And for the larger implementations of test data generation, there are some enterprise solutions available out there. IBM, InfoSphere, Optum, GenRocket, SAP, and Computer Associates all provide tools and options to be able to help you do that on sort of an enterprise level. Another question that commonly comes up is how much data to validate. And in certain cases, that really is just driven by the requirements. So we've had a customer in the pharmaceutical industry who was migrating from one data source to another. And by law, they were required to validate 100% of their data. So that really drives how much data they should validate. In other cases, the regulations may be for 90% or 80%. And if that's the case, it's pretty clear how much data you need to validate. But in most cases, it's going to be time, resource, and scope driven. So you're going to be working around your release timeline, how many available resources you have, and the scope of authoring and executing those tests. So working within this formula of this model, you want to work out how long it's going to take you to create and write these tests, and also how long it's going to take you to execute these tests. And with that, you should be able to work out a timeline on how long your effort is going to be, whether you need to add resources or reduce scope or extend the timeline. These are things that you'll all have to work around. In certain cases, the timeline may not be able to move. And in that case, you want to do a risk assessment. So identifying and executing those high priority tests first. And that can be done by taking a look at the business acceptance criteria. So the end users would define their primary data use cases. So you can focus your tests that handle that particular set of data. And also looking at the critical paths. So how data flows through the high priority endpoints within your system, locating and identifying those tests and focusing your effort around those first in order to meet your timeline or data validation needs. Given that we are dealing with so much data, automation is a good solution, but you sort of want to identify and understand before you implement this automation. I would say to avoid complicated single-use test cases. So if you're dealing with complicated transformation and it's only needing to be executed one time, that may not be a good candidate for automation. What you really want to do is focus on the repeatable testing paths and ensure that you have modularization of your test data sets as well as your test scripts. The test data sets themselves, how much data you're testing. You want to make sure that if you're going to select an automation tool, that the assigned hardware resources and performance of that tool is able to handle the load of the data sets that are under test here. And you also need to make sure that in any estimations that you're giving for your testing effort, that you're including the time that's needed to prepare these environments. Data setup does become integral, especially when dealing with automation tests, as you want them to be repeatable and understandable. Another factor here is database performance. So you want to make sure that you're setting expectations for your dev or your QA environments, your lower environments on the hardware and responsiveness. If you're using an automation tool, the SQL query response time is going to factor into that overall test run. So you're going to want to make sure you're accounting for that in your overall testing efforts. A lot of companies these days are making the move to a cloud environment. So the question comes up, how do I test in my cloud environment? And the answer is we're following the same testing methodologies that we're discussing here, but we are considering or having considerations for cloud connections and the scalability available within the clouds. And it's important to note if you're using an automation solution that you're confirming that the tools allow for connectivity to the cloud environment. Some tools may be able to handle an on-prem server connection based on the technology you're using, but may have some difficulties when you're moving that into the cloud based on security or authentication issues. So it's important to work those out before you make any decisions on how to implement that. And we also see some companies doing a hybrid approach, so some on-prem, some in the cloud. Important in that case to, as we discussed with the mapping document, have an interface document where you would define the entry and exit points. How is the system designed in that sense? Companies moving their entire systems from on-prem to the cloud will undergo a migration effort, and you want to make sure that the migration effort is clearly defined in your conversion requirements and mappings. So in addition to the ETL processes that are going on, is your data going to be able to look the same as it did versus on-prem to the cloud? And environment scalability is also a consideration. A lot of reason the companies are moving to the cloud is for the scalability that the cloud offers. However, you want to make sure that you're dealing with that in your lower testing environments as well. How much resource availability is in that environment, because that can sort of define how much testing you can do within that environment. So now we just want to go over some components of a data validation assessment and what that entails. So the goals of the data validation assessment is to receive an expert evaluation of your current process. And once that's done, provide recommendations on how to improve your process. And ultimately, a proposal for successful implementation of your goals. So some of the components here that we'll be dealing with and looking at are a business analysis. So your requirements that you have on site, what is the expectations of the business, your data architecture that you have implemented, which technologies are involved, which job schedules for the ETLs are running, the ETL testing process itself, how is the testing team looking at requirements and developing their tests, how does that integrate with your data or DevOps systems that you have in place. Is there enough resource coverage for the goals that you are trying to achieve? And metrics evaluation, how are these metrics being reported out? And finally, risk assessment, what sort of risks are acceptable or unacceptable based on your current situation. Now, to gather this information, we'd start with an interview of key players, first starting with the business and data analysts. They are responsible for creating the requirements. Then talking with the QA testers to find out how they develop and execute test plans. The architects who are responsible for the environment setup, both in production and in your testing environments. It's important to understand the similarities and the differences between the two. And the developers, who are the ones that are coding this ETL process, how they're performing unit tests, how is their approach for developing this code. The DBA is also a key factor in the performance and the stress of each of these environments. and then ultimately the end users, so the ones that are benefiting from what is going on with all of this data in your system. So once you've completed the interviews, additionally, we'll take a look at the process documentation, so the requirements in the mapping documentation, your testing process design, how is that implemented, analysis of the tools being used for your DevOps, your data ops, how that's all integrated together, and then taking a look on how everything is being reported out, and is everyone sort of satisfied with those reporting metrics. After that is all taken into consideration, some of the deliverables you should be able to expect are a detailed analysis report with recommendations for improvement, a presentation to your team on those findings, and ultimately a proposal for a path forward. How do you successfully implement your goals now that we sort of understand where you are at in your data validation process? So now we take a little bit deeper dive into some data testing strategies that are available and out there. And what you're looking at right now is sort of a implementation of a data warehouse system. So you're having source data come in from multiple sources. That's going to go through an ETL process into a big data lake. After that, a data warehouse is going to pull information from that lake via another ETL process. And that ultimately ends up in the data mart where the BI and analytics reports will pull information from. So you can see there are a lot of layers as the data moves through the system. And the ETL developers involved are really responsible for moving that data from one source to another. So this can be multiple groups that are working on different layers. They may have different specialties. Either way, they should be developing off of the mapping requirements that are defined for each of these ETL legs. And as a tester, you're going to come in and sort of look at it in the same way. Anytime data is moving through the system, that is what I want to consider a testing point. So as I'm coming from the source data to my data lake, to my data warehouse, those are all considered testing points. And even if you want to look at your BI layer, that is also a testing point. So there is some development or code involved in how I'm pulling that data. That should also be considered one of your testing points in the system. And the basis and the foundation of all of this comes to the mapping document. And this is a source to target mapping example for a customer table that we're looking at right now. You'll see that each mapping represents a column within the target table and has a unique identifier. So for example, row 1.01 is a direct map from the purchaser table to the customer table. Row 1.02 does go through some transformation. So you're taking that full name field and you're breaking it up in your target system. And this sort of really lays out the most fundamental pieces of how your ETL process is working. And it's there to capture your business rules, to map out the data flow, and at its basic level, it should contain the source input definitions, the target output definitions, and any logic that is applied between the two. So now once you have a data mapping in place, there are a couple different or several different testing methods that you can work with to test them out. So the most basic level is viewing your source and your target data manually. So using your SQL editor, whatever it may be, pulling data from both the source and the target, and doing what we call a stare and compare, looking at the source and the target, seeing if the data lines up and visually looks good. Another method for checking is record counts. So this is doing a count on the number of records in your source table and doing a count on the number of the records in your target table, seeing that they line up, making sure that the data that was expected to move has moved and the record counts themselves do look good. Taking it a little bit deeper to the next level would be maybe a minus query, which actually gives you the ability to identify differences in the data between the two tables. So this is utilizing SQL. You're subtracting your source query from your target query, and also subtracting your target query from your source query. And with that, you should be able to identify the row differences within your table. And finally, There are automation tools out there that you can use to set up these source and target compares. Generally, when you're dealing with large sets of data, using a visual compare, for example, may be resource intensive. If you're dealing with a million rows, for example, that may be unrealistic to expect a resource to manually go through and inspect those tables or even put them into Excel. So when you're dealing with larger sets of data and many data testing points, automation does play a key factor in giving you the sort of ability to handle all of that. So the ideal goal for any data validation process is to reach a level of maturity where you're tracking your ROI, there are predictive data issues, and you're achieving auditable results. Everyone on the team is on board. This is usually done through implementing a successful automated solution. What we find is most companies are between levels 1 and 4 and really striving to get to level 5. So you may be using some Excel or ad hoc reporting. You're finding that you're facing some of the challenges that we talked about earlier. You're encountering those bad data issues. You really want to go through a data validation assessment, take yourself to that next level, and ultimately achieve the most mature level of testing that you can for your organization. All right, so finally, we're going to take a look at a case study here. So in dealing with a company that was in the financial industry, they did have a development and a QA team assigned to their ETL process. However, they were still suffering from incorrect data fields being populated on their BI reports. Development cycles were being frequently delayed, and management itself was losing confidence in the BI reporting data. Dealing with so many issues, there was a real concern about the decisions they were making and if it was done off of accurate data. So senior RTTS resources were brought in to assess the process. As we discussed before, we interviewed the key players. We reviewed all of their process documentation and the tools that they have implemented. And some of the problem areas we had identified for this particular company were their requirements. So the mapping documentations were maybe not fully realized and were sparsely located throughout the organization. They did have a ticketing system that was implemented for development work. However, the traceability for that was really non-existent. They were being assigned to the different developers, but there was nothing really to tie it back to for the testing team or the business users to really identify what the requirements were. And the testing process itself was of a low level maturity. As we saw before, they were using table row counts, sampling, and Excel comparisons. So they were still seeing, even with these efforts, data issues within their system. Some recommendations for improvement that this company sort of took on were to centralize that mapping document. So linking those requirements in the mapping document to the tickets that developers were working on and to the test cases that the test team was implementing tied everything together. So there was, at this point, no question of what the expectations were for the ETL process. Everything was centralized and mapped within this documentation. The communication was sort of lacking between the testing team and the development team and the business users. So we recommended a new data analyst role. And this data analyst took on the responsibility of organizing and owning the mapping document. And that really brought sort of a communication, it overcame a communication barrier that they were having. And subsequent to that, it narrowed the focus of the stand-up meetings that they were having. So stand-up meetings themselves in an agile methodology are meant to be brief. They ended up turning into sort of requirements meetings, but with the new data analyst role and the mapping documentation, that really narrowed the focus, and the developers and the testing team can just list their tasks at hand and move on from there. And given the amount of data that they were covering, we also suggested an implemented automation solution. And this allowed them to expand their coverage for the larger data sets that they wanted. to test, and they definitely realized some benefits from that compared to the old way of them doing things. So I just want to now talk about a demo for an example of what this company was dealing with, how they were doing things originally, and how their automation implementation sort of benefited them. As an example here, one of their tables was storing a customer address. And as you can see from this mapping document example here, we have a source and a target. The target table just has 3 columns. The single column for address is concatenation of 4 different columns from the source. So you can see here that it's easily identified and updated in the mapping document that has been generated here. And this was not only done for this table, but all the tables in their environment. And that sort of really lays out the expected transformations that they were looking to see. Next, I want to switch over to one of their test cases and how it looked before the data assessment. So in this example, we're still testing the customer table, but we're using, as you can see, row counts to verify that data has moved successfully. So a typical test case, for example, would prepare the environment. It would count the rows in the source, run the ETL jobs, count the rows in the target. And you can see here these steps both pass because the data does align. And then just taking a sample set, as you can see, there's a little over 1 million rows. So taking a sample set from maybe the middle of the data set and comparing that in Excel, using simple Excel formulas, you can see that everything looks like it is updating properly. If I were a tester and this was my test, I would mark it successfully as passed. However, they were still seeing issues specifically around the address later on in their systems. So the recommendation was to expand their testing capabilities. And to do that, we recommended an automated implementation. So to sort of highlight how that would work, we're going to show you an automated testing solution. In this particular case, we are using Query Surge. There are several other tools out there that can perform this automated testing. Query Surge being one, Informatica DVO, or I believe Tricentis has a suite of testing tools that are available. But we're going to be looking at Query Surge for this particular demo. And in Query Surge, the tests are called query pairs. So a query pair is just a source and a target. So you're pointing to 2 different connections, one on the source side, one on the target, and you're implementing some SQL logic in order to bring back and run those tests. So Query Surge here is a tab available called Design Time Run, where you can run that one-off test. And as you can see, the automation tool found the same results. The source and the target rows both match up. However, it does highlight a failed row count of 517. So if we were to go in and drill down, we can see that these 517 rows between the source and the target are not fully matching. And if you can look here, the way Query Surge would display it is your source columns are on the left, your target columns are on the right, and it's a sort of side-by-side comparison based on your ID. You can see that in the target field, we're seeing some truncation issues on a select number of customers. Now, it's not happening for all of the customers, but only a select few. And it turns out for this particular company, certain customer bases based on their loyalty, we're going through their loyalty rewards, we're going through a different ETL path than the rest of the customers, and they were being impacted here. So the automation was able to sort of expand the testing coverage to find this issue, whereas those lower maturity level tests really weren't able to capture that particular issue. And some of the other benefits they realized of being able to schedule several tests like this in a row, run them on a scheduler and review results based on their different sprints that we're running, and report out to the different team members the progress of those reports. So just a sort of highlight of how an automated testing solution can help you out in your testing efforts. And I think with that, that concludes our presentation, our webinar here. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you. Do we have any questions out there from our attendees? Bill, you out there? I think you may be on mute.
Sorry, seems like I was still on mute. Okay, so thanks, Mike. We will not take questions, so please type them into the chat window if you haven't already. And we've already had a few come in. So the first question is, how long does an assessment typically take?
Yes, so a good question. Typically, I would say an assessment would take between 5 and 7 business days. But ultimately, that's decided by your schedule. We'll work around. We want to make sure we're hitting and interviewing all the key players, as we discussed earlier. And usually that takes around 5 to 7 business days to complete the interviews as well as the review process.
All right, next question. What are the main issues that you find on these assessments?
Yeah, I would say one of the main issues that we come across in the assessments are traceability and the mapping documentation not being fully realized. So as we saw in the case study, maybe a ticketing system is involved, but it's not fully integrated within a mapping document solution. That would be what I say is the most common issue that we would find, and resolving that certainly does have tremendous benefits for the entire team.
All right, next question. Why did the Jets cut Leveon Bell? Oh, no, that's my question. We'll save that for later. Is there a mapping document requirement for data testing? I think the real question is, do you need a mapping document?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably the key piece here in this testing effort. It's strongly recommended that there is a process around creating and validating that mapping. That's going to be the key documentation that's going to be used by all of the team members involved to develop these data validation tests and strategies.
Okay. What is the best way to generate test data?
Well, a lot of companies out there, as we discussed before, will copy their production data. Though if you take a look at your data permutations and figuring out if you're fully exercising ETL logic here, that may not always work. But we are seeing some homegrown solutions around that, some SQL scripts being implemented. If you further need test data generation, there are some enterprise tools out there, as we mentioned before in the slides. GenRocket, IBM, Optum, Computer Associates all have enterprise level tools to be able to assist you with that effort.
All right, next question. What are the tools in the marketplace for automating data validation?
So as we saw in the demo, Query Surge is one of them. There are also tools available by Informatica, DBO. I believe Tricentis has a test suite or a test suite of tools that are focused around that. And we're also seeing some freeware tools available. So companies themselves using a freeware developers, Squirrel or Toad, and writing their own scripts to sort of achieve that automated data validation.
Next question. What skill set do you need for data testing?
So as a data tester, I would say you would need an understanding of SQL and how that works, and also an understanding of the business that you're in. Putting those two pieces together and working with a mapping document really would be an advantage for a data tester to be able to complete some of the strategies that we discussed today.
All right. What was the greatest challenge you faced on a project?
The greatest challenge I've faced on a project, that's a good question, because there certainly have been a lot of them. What we're finding is no one really is that at that level 5 of maturity. There's always challenges to work around. But I will say communication between the teams and realizing a full mapping document and the benefits of that mapping document was probably one of the greatest challenges that I faced on multiple engagements. And it really is delightful to see, once you get that mapping document implemented and the teams are sort of working together now with a single purpose, that's really the goal here, is to improve your data validation process and get everyone on board in the process of doing that.
Okay, next question. What is the ideal percent of data coverage on a project?
I mean, ideally, you'd want to test all your data, right? You want to make sure that you have 100% confidence in what's being shown to the end users, whether they be the executives in the business intelligence report or, customers. We know that that is not always the case. So it's sort of a balance of, your time, your resources, your scope, and what risk you're willing to take. And that's going to change depending on the industry you're in. Everyone has different requirements, but, ideally you want to validate everything, but realistically, you may be focusing in on those high priority data endpoints.
All right. Well, it looks like that was the last question, Mike. And if anybody has any questions, chat it now. Nope, that looks like it. That's the end. All right. Well, great. That wraps up our Q&A session. Thanks again for your time and participation today. We'll be sending a follow-up email to you with a link to the recording and our contact information if you have any additional questions. Otherwise, have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Have a great day.